is our last at lunch of the season and for the spring. And we've had a really remarkable group of guests, and I can't think of a better finale than Joseph Berger. Many of you are familiar with his insightful, sensitive reportage through his 30-year career at the New York Times. He covered a lot of different kinds of subjects and people, but he had a special interest in the American Jewish experience. Among the many people he wrote about was Elie Wiesel, perhaps the world's most famous Auschwitz survivor. Joe's 2016 obituary of Wiesel was brilliant and became the catalyst for his new biography, Confronting the Silence, which is coming out next week from Yale University Press. Later, we're going to have a discount code for anybody tuned in to the webinar, so you can order a book and get a 30% discount. I'm absolutely delighted to have Joe with us here today. You can put yourself on video, Joe, and welcome. Really glad to have you here.
Okay.
So
It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
oh, it's really an honor. The book is incredible. It's so beautifully written, and you know, obviously sad in many places, but really just a
Thank you.
remarkable piece of work. So I wanted to start off with a whole idea that I think writing any biography is a daunting task, but it takes a particular kind of chutzpah when you're subject to someone like Elie Wiesel, who's not only an icon, but a prolific writer who told some version of his own story numerous times in fiction and nonfiction. Having read your book, I can tell our audience you've done an amazing job. But could you tell us, how did you come to write this biography of Elie Wiesel, including how did you come to meet him?
Well, I had heard Elie Wiesel speak at the annual Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremony that they would have at the Temple Emmanuel. My parents are Holocaust survivors. They asked me a few times to join them, and I did. And you know, he was very easy to see how eloquent he was, what a gift he had for phrases, memorable phrases, and how thoughtful and intelligent a person he was. But he had this aura of a prophet about him, and I was very lucky that in 1973 the Post sent me to Israel to cover the Mideast War, and on the plane to Jerusalem to Lod was Elie Wiesel and his friend Sigmund Strochlitz. They had their shoes off, their ties loose, and they were humming Yiddish melodies to each other, which I recognized. And my sense was that they were delighted to be going to Israel at a time that Israel needed them. They were bringing medical supplies. And by the way, this was at the tail end of the war, which is when I was sent. So I think they had a sense that Israel was recovering from the surprise attack. So in all of that, there was a kind of a joy that came through. And so that's how I first realized, hey, he's not a prophet, he's a human being. And Wiesel loved to sing. I think he sang at Carnegie Hall at one occasion. And he wrote cantatas. I mean, we that's not known about him as well. But eventually, when I joined the New York Times, I was asked to write a profile when he won the Nobel Prize. And again, we got into a discussion after all the reporters had left about how he believes in God and practices his religion, given the fact that he saw the destruction of 6 million Jews and 1 million of them children. And he says, you know, I may be angry at God, but I'm not going to take it out on Shabbos. And he gave the sense that this was a lifetime quarrel that he had with God. he hadn't completely resolved it, but he wasn't going to give up the Judaism that he'd grown up with.
And if you could just talk about that a little bit. I guess I knew that he was a very learned, scholarly type, but I didn't know that he had that deep Hasidic connection really from his youth. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, he grew up in Sighet, and Sighet was a town. I think it's bigger than what we usually refer to as a shtetl, but it was close. And it was a town where probably, I think, a third to a half of the population was Jewish. And very many of them were Hasidic, particularly the Vizhnitz Hasidim. This is a Hungarian town. And Elie excelled in Torah and Talmud. His grandfather was a Vizhnitz Hasid. His mother was a Vizhnitz Hasid. His father not, but he was observant. And so he grew up with a very strong Hasidic background. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to tackle this biography was that I wanted to know how a little Hasidic boy became this iconic figure, Elie Wiesel, that the whole world knows. And in fact, that I think that is the arc of my book. You see how after the war he was left an orphan. His mother was killed immediately upon arrival at Auschwitz, and his father slowly died from beatings and sickness in Auschwitz and Buchenwald. And after the war, Elie was an orphan, but because he was an orphan, he was put on a train of 400 orphans that ended up going to an orphanage outside of Paris. De Gaulle had agreed to take in 400 orphans. So Elie Wiesel is outside of Paris. He goes from being 16, 17 to 18. And when everybody has to disperse, and many of them end up going to Palestine, he goes to the Sorbonne. He studies at the Sorbonne in Paris, hangs around with Jean-Paul Sartre. I mean, how many Holocaust survivors do you know hung around with Jean-Paul Sartre? Enjoys the cafe life of Paris, becomes a cultivated intellectual. And that was very important to his development, because so many of the survivors were blue collar, had to take blue collar jobs when they came here, but because they needed to support to put bread on their families' tables. But Elie was on a different plane, and so we get to see his Hasidic background transforming, but he never lost his love for the Hasidic, for Hasidic music, Hasidic song. Anyway, I think that.
No, that's wonderful, and I think that you've already started to answer, because a fundamental question I had throughout writing the whole book is you humanize Elie Wiesel so much the way you do now. And I wondered if just even, you had known him before and interviewed him, but I was wondering if in the course of researching and writing the book, which takes you to a whole other level of engagement with somebody, did your feelings about him change at all, or did it just deepen feelings that you might have already had about him?
I would say the latter. What he, you have to understand, and people I don't think remember, that at the end of the war, and the years after the war, there was really a silence that kind of enveloped the Holocaust. I think the survivors were either too traumatized or too ashamed because of what they had, the awful experiences they'd been through, to talk about it. And Americans were probably too guilty because they hadn't done more, and I mean American Jews as well. They hadn't done more to make sure that refugees were admitted to the country, to put pressure on the White House to change their immigration policies. So there was this silence that enveloped the Holocaust. And Elie Wiesel more than any other person, exhumed the Holocaust from the way I put it, from the dustbin of history, because by his, when the 1967 war took place in Israel, and there was suddenly this explosion of Jewish pride, because they had beaten the Israelis had beaten the armies of Egypt and Syria and Jordan. People wanted to know more about Jewish life, and they also wanted to know more about the Holocaust. And there was this man who had written a memoir, Night. By the way, it's interesting. Night, when it first came out, sold about 1,000 copies, and the second year also sold about 1,000 copies. But because of the 6-day war, people wanted to know more and hear more. And here's someone who had written this vivid memoir of what life in Auschwitz was like. And so people wanted to hear Elie Wiesel speak. And he began getting invitations to synagogues all over the country. And suddenly he became the torchbearer for the Holocaust survivors, and later, for genocide everywhere, for the victims of genocide everywhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that your parents were Holocaust survivors, and I thought, didn't you yourself spend your early childhood in refugee camps? Do I remember that wrong? Or
I was born in Russia because my parents, they were not in concentration camps, but they fled the Nazis. I mean, their stories are a little more complicated than that, but basically they fled the Nazis, made their way to the Soviet Union. They met there, married in 1943. I was born in 1945. And when the Russians allowed the Polish Jews to repatriate, my parents went back to Poland, realized that life in their hometowns Jewish life in the hometowns had vanished. And so they ended up in the Displaced Persons camp in Berlin, where my brother was born.
And you wrote about this experience just to tell the audience that Joe also wrote a beautiful memoir several years ago called Displaced Persons, where he wrote about his family history and subsequent his growing up in New York. And I wanted you to actually talk about that because it feels so relevant to how you're speaking about Elie Wiesel and how he made Jews feel, and certainly Jews from a Holocaust background, which I am myself. My parents were Auschwitz. My mother was an Auschwitz survivor, is an Auschwitz survivor. And I was wondering if you could talk about how your background, coming from being born in Russia and to people who were basically Holocaust survivors, from having to leave to have their world destroyed. I was wondering how that background affected the writing of this biography and maybe your entire career. I was thinking when you said you were so lucky when the Post sent you to cover the war in Israel, a lot of people might not think it's so lucky to be sent to cover a war. But if you could talk a little bit about.
Well, lucky in the fact that I got to meet Elie Wiesel on an airplane.
Oh, okay, yes, yes, and also
right.
A good story. But I was wondering if, I do feel that somebody with your background brought a different level of emotionality and intensity and knowledge to the writing of this biography. And I was wondering how it affected you personally, going through this story of this life.
Well, when Elie Wiesel talked about the fact that he was angry with God for allowing 1 million children to be killed, let alone his own little sister. That I understood that. I mean, that was a question that that I had wrestled with, and kind of came down with no resolution. But like Elie, because of the feelings I had about Jewish tradition and Jewish life, I continued on that same track. So I think that made a difference. I also understood when Elie was objected to the way too many of the films and books cheapened the Holocaust for entertainment reasons. I could understand that as well. I mean, but I think mostly I got a sense of what it took to overcome that kind of background. And Elie, when he came here, he worked as a journalist for 25 years, and he wasn't earning very much money. He struggled to keep things going, and in that way, he was very, very, very much like many of the other survivors, struggling to kind of build a life, figuring out whether they wanted to have children or not. These were issues that Elie confronted, that so many of the survivors I knew confronted as well. But also, I think I got a sense of the fact that survivors weren't just bleak and depressed. They laughed. I remember my parents would get together with survivors of all stripes, people who had been in camps, and people who had, and all of them had lost so many relatives close to them, some parents and siblings, and yet they had this moxie to go on. And I saw that in Elie Wiesel as well. To raise their children, to make sure their children got a good education, piano lessons, went to summer camps, and it was hard a hard thing to do for them. But they didn't want to dwell on the past, though it never left them. But they needed to overcome it and to build a new life for themselves. And if you think about it, it takes more. I mean, the fact that they survived the Holocaust often was a matter of luck, or depending on what kind of treatment they had, what line they went into. But the fact that they were as resilient as they were, I think that took a lot of courage, a lot of grit, a lot of moxie, as I said, and I admired them for that. So I think all of that played into my understanding of Elie.
Yeah, and I feel that comes across so really beautifully in the book, is that level of understanding, and the way that you can take this person who I think for a lot of people is a prophet or larger than life, and bring out that humanity. It's really wonderfully done. And yet I feel you also, you're a great journalist, and you also look at things very clear-eyed, and your book probes the dichotomies in Elie Wiesel's life. He was this prolific author, but much better known for his role as a Holocaust survivor. And I think that bugged him sometimes. And he spoke passionately on behalf of human rights, including those of Palestinians, yet he could become close with people like Sheldon Adelson. And he was this humble academic and Torah scholar, but then he felt like he spent a lot of the later part of his life wearing a tuxedo. And he inspired such diverse people like Harvey Weinstein on the one hand, who I think came from a Holocaust background, and then Barack Obama on the other. And I was wondering, just how do you address all of these complexities, especially today when people are always drawn as so black and white and good and bad, and yet people are complex. And I was wondering if that was a struggle for you, or just part of your normal way of approaching things.
Well, you could see Elie growing and changing over time. So, I mean, many of his friends think that toward the very end of his life, when he was suffering from multiple myeloma, and he'd had a quintuple bypass operation and other ailments, that his judgment was not as strong as it had been before, and may have made some of the errors that you mentioned. Similarly, throughout his life, he wasn't always a success with everything. I mean, he inspired that wonderful museum in Washington, and perhaps it never would have gotten built without him. But because Elie was not and his wife and son will tell you that, was not a pragmatic person, a person who can handle the practicalities of life, like finance and money issues. So when he became the head of the council that built the museum, he turned it into a philosophical debating club. But years went by and nothing got built. So the people on the council realized that they needed to get a builder in there to take his place. And Elie, by the way, Elie writes about this in his own memoir. He wrote a memoir called "And the Rivers, All the Rivers Run to the Sea," a beautiful memoir, by the way. And he talks about his leadership of the council, so that he eventually had to resign because they brought in a builder, a guy who specialized in building malls, commercial malls, and he got it done. Elie couldn't have gotten it done. As I've said at other forums, Elie couldn't handle a kitchen renovation. How's he going to build a museum?
Well, kitchen renovations are hard. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Well, going back to him as a writer, I reread actually Night when I was getting ready to do this interview. I don't think I'd read it since my kids were assigned it in middle school. And, it's such a powerful book, and so much of his writing was so beautiful. But I wonder, did he have, I think in the book you said no, that he really didn't have any kind of a relationship with the people of the 20th century. We think of the American Jewish canon, Philip Roth and Saul Bellow. Were they just operating in a completely different world from him, or did they have any kind of relationship?
I don't know of any relationship that he had with Saul Bellow or Philip Roth. It didn't present itself in the material that I looked through in his archives in Boston, at Boston University. But he knew quite well Primo Levi and some other Jewish writers. But no, and I don't think he wrote books as a novelist who's trying to preserve his work as great literature. He wrote books that came out of his experience and his heart. But he wasn't a kind of a literary. He didn't belong to literary clubs or a literary association. That wasn't his style. But his novels are particularly Gates of the Forest and A Beggar in Jerusalem and A Town Beyond the Wall are really wonderful books and regarded as important contributions to world literature. So think about it. What a man of all seasons he was.
Yeah. You had, it sounds like, quite incredible access to Elie Wiesel's widow, Marion, and his son. And it sounds like you spent quite a bit of time with them talking about Elie Wiesel. Could you just, I think most people tuning in don't have that kind of opportunity. Could you just describe what those sessions were like for you and how those conversations altered or enhanced your view of Wiesel?
Well, Alicia, his son, was quite candid in talking about his own relation with his father. Alicia was probably in high school when he began to feel that he wanted to be his own person and not just recognized as Elie Wiesel's son. And he went on to Yale, and Yale began to adopt a persona that we wouldn't associate with Elie Wiesel. He grew his hair into a mohawk. His mother told me he sometimes painted it green, sometimes purple. He frightened his parents by taking up skydiving. In fact, Elie told him at one point, "I'll do one skydive if you agree to stop it forever." And this kind of thorny relationship went on for about 10 years, according to the son, to Alicia. So I was very, very pleased about that. I think Alicia felt ultimately that I didn't give enough credence to Elie's passionate devotion to Israel, to explain why, let's say, an advertisement ran condemning the Palestinians in Gaza for using children as shields against the missiles that were against the bombings that the Israelis were aiming at the Palestinians in Gaza. Friends of his told me that he would never have used the language of followers of child sacrifice and followers of Moloch. Alicia disagreed with that interpretation, but he's heavily quoted in terms of his telling us that his father was passionate about Israel and really felt that it was being mistreated in the press and elsewhere.
But yet you also write about Elie Wiesel's initial reaction to Israel, which I think was not uncommon, that there was, particularly in the years after the war, there was almost even though without the Holocaust survivors, one could argue there wouldn't be an Israel today, but there was this sort of split, just like you said, there was a silence here about the Holocaust. I think in Israel, there was always this sort of ambivalence in a way about them, and that he felt that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Elie went to Israel as a correspondent for, I believe it was for Yediot Achronot at that time. And he visited Israel, and had been eagerly looking forward to the visit. And he loved the country, but he was also very disappointed that too many of the Sabras disdained the experience of the survivors, wondering, why didn't they fight back with more power, with more planning, just as the Israelis had done in the 1948 war. And Elie's response to that was, you don't know what it was like. When you have guns pointed at you and people willing to shoot you at the slightest whim, so that any action of protest would mean death. Because you don't understand that, you can't abuse the survivors for not having done more. And I think eventually Israelis came to terms with that as more survivors settled in Israel. And and of course, now they have many commemorations of the Holocaust, including one where traffic stops around the country for a moment of silence. I mean, so he recognized that change, but because of the negative reaction he got, he began to be gun shy about criticizing Israel and decided he wasn't going to. And there was a later speech he gave that also resulted in a backlash. And I think it was 1973, 74, when he asked the survivors, can you try to do something for the Palestinians who have lost their land and maybe not take away so much of the land as settlements. And the reaction he got in the Israeli press and among Israelis who commented on it was, who are you to tell us how to run our country? You're a diaspora Jew. If you want to do that, if you want to tell us how to run our country, come live here. And so Elie decided to not criticize Israel again publicly, and he didn't.
Yeah. So you talked before, I meant to ask you about his son's reaction and what you got from his son. What was it like talking to Marianne, and what was the nature of their relationship? And tell people, I think, a little bit about who she is and what her role was besides being Elie Wiesel's wife.
Well, according to Elisha, and other people told me the same thing, Elie Wiesel would not have been Elie Wiesel without Marianne. Elisha told me, and I'm going to read you the quote, which I just found. My mother has a real gift for the scale of things, how to take a small idea and make it have impact. My father had a passion for literature and philosophy, but my mother knows how to operate in the world and make ideas become reality. Without indulging in a stereotype, Elie Wiesel was an intellectual, a very thoughtful intellectual. But he didn't enjoy dealing with the practicalities of living. And Marianne had a sense of, you want to get your message out there, you've got to meet certain people, talk to certain groups, get yourself, don't reject offers to go on television. These are important for getting your message out. And so I think Marianne was very essential to Elie Wiesel's becoming the messenger to mankind.
Interesting. Behind, what is it? The old stereotype behind every great man is a great woman. Now, I don't think you can say that anymore, but probably still true. Just in terms of the process of writing the book and grappling with all these different aspects that we've been talking about, just in the course of doing it, what was the hardest part to deal with? And maybe what was the part, when I say fun, I don't mean fun like ha-ha fun, but where did you feel, wow, this is a great moment? So start with the hardest part. Like, what was the hardest part to grapple with and to nail down for you?
It's a good question. Which I haven't been asked before. So, let's see. The hardest part was just taking in what happened to Elie in Auschwitz. I mean, besides his own memoir, besides the description at night, he went into much greater detail in his memoir. including things that hadn't surfaced before. And just the way he had to witness his father getting beaten and feeling he couldn't do anything about it because he would end up being killed by the capos, or sent away to the gas chambers. So I could just imagine seeing a boy seeing his father succumb to that, succumb to the humiliation and the weakness of not being able to do anything. And Elie was almost lifelong guilty about that, that he couldn't save his father. The other difficult thing to handle was there were suggestions that Elie pulled his punches in night. Naomi Seidman wrote a very long essay analyzing night and analyzing versions of night, the Yiddish version and the later Hebrew version compared to the popular version in English that we have. And you see, he doesn't, in the English version and the French version, he doesn't attack the world for its silence, for not doing more. He doesn't attack Christianity for having seeded the animus against Christian organizations, for having seeded the animus against Jews that resulted in the kind of popular persecution in Germany and elsewhere. The way I saw it was, and this was what his defenders say, he was a young writer. He was trying to get a book published, and his mentor was a Nobel Prize winning French writer, Francois Mauriac, who was very Catholic. And he wasn't going to offend Mauriac. As a young writer, you have to understand that. And so, dealing with that in the book was difficult. But I was lucky in the sense that because I knew how strong Elie Wiesel would later become in terms of his condemnation of Pope Pius and the Hungarian, the Romanian government, the Hungarian government, for allowing the deaths of so many Jews in their countries, and the fact that he repeatedly took on Germany in the Reichstag, and made very clear that he condemned the Germans who perpetrated the Holocaust, not the children. But he didn't shy away from condemning the Germans to their face. And so the complaints about his pulling punches, which some writers took up on after Naomi Seidman's essay, I felt were not warranted.
I liked in the book the way you grappled with it. Even though you're so scrupulously a journalist, but you also, I think, put your cards on the table in terms of your sympathy for what Elie Wiesel was going through himself. And I think that's very powerful also. One of the things that I also really like so much about the book is that it's a biography, obviously, first and foremost, but you also deal with politics and the changing views of America and the world towards the Holocaust, after the world, up till today. And I was wondering, in terms of that, just even talking to people about writing the book or whatever. How do you think, where does the Holocaust fit in the public consciousness today? I know that's a huge question, we're getting towards the end, but I was wondering if did you feel a responsibility to keep that story alive, or was that part of your thought process in writing the book?
I do. I mean, was it part of my thought process? It was just kind of assumed, mentally assumed that this is important to me. I think the young people growing up today may not know that much about the Holocaust. May not know that much about World War II. What took place, particularly with the persecution and slaughter of Jews, and so I worry that this will be forgotten, and the lessons will be forgotten. And when you see something like the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, and you realize that so many people supported that. Like almost half the country still to this day supports a president who thought that these were good people. I worry. I think you have to worry. Don't they realize that it was lies like this, that the election was stolen, lies like that led to the advent of Hitler, and to the popular support he received, and to his ability to drum up antagonism toward the Jews of Germany, and so when you see that, you realize how important it is to get people to really understand the dangers of those kinds of events and talk, and that you have to see what an outcome might be down in the future if we don't do something about that.
Thank you, Joe. I cannot believe we are out of time, but I just want to say thank you so much for coming here today, for writing this really excellent book. You can get it in a discount if you look on your chat. And also, just from a reader's point of view, this is part of the Yale University Jewish Lives series, and it's a hefty book in terms of its thought process and content, but you can actually read it without suffering, except for the emotional suffering of this story. It's really beautifully done. Thank you so much for coming here today,
Well,
Joe.
thank you, Julie, for asking such good questions.
Wow.
Some of which I haven't given enough thought to, but I appreciate that. I will now give even more thought to it.
Well, you answered beautifully, and it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.